Hey, church family. Happy New Year. As we begin 2022, I've got a question for you. And my question is, are you familiar with the 50-20 principle? If you haven't heard of the 50-20 principle, it takes its name from Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, toward the end of the book, where Joseph's brothers are appearing before Joseph, and they're fearful that he's going to want to exact revenge on them for the things they've done to him. And he says to them, Genesis 50 verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives." Now, if you're not familiar with the backstory behind that, I'd encourage you to take the time to read through Genesis chapters 37 to 50. Joseph's life is a story of contrasts. Some have titled his life From Prisoner to Prince, or From the Pit to the Palace. Joseph was a man who was loved by his father, but hated by his brothers. And by the time we get to Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, Joseph's brothers, the ones who had earlier sold him into slavery, have now traveled from their home in Canaan, where they were starving because of the famine that had spread through the land. They traveled to Egypt, the only place that had food. And they came to Joseph, the one who was in charge of the distribution of the food, to ask if he could give them something to eat. The thing they didn't realize was that Joseph was their brother. And it was probably a good thing they didn't realize that, because when he reveals to them who he is, they are terrified. They assume that he's going to want to exact revenge for the wrongs that they did to him. But man, were they surprised when he pointed to the 50-20 principle, when he said to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives." As you look at the life of Joseph, you continually see two repetitive themes. Number one, Joseph remained faithful to God at all times, regardless of the cost. And number two, Joseph's life almost never went in the way that he planned. Joseph didn't plan to be betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit. He didn't plan to be sold into slavery and transported to a foreign land. He didn't plan, once he got to that foreign land, to be falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit and then thrown into a prison to serve a sentence for that crime he hadn't committed. He didn't plan, while in prison, to be able to help someone who was about to be released, who could remember him and potentially secure his freedom, only to find that person who promised to remember Joseph promptly forgetting him. He didn't plan to be promoted to the number 2 person in the kingdom of Egypt. He didn't plan to be in a position to get payback from his brothers. But even though none of these things were according to Joseph's plan, they were all part of God's plan. So 2 things I want to challenge you with as we enter 2022. Like Joseph, number 1, put God first no matter what, no matter the cost. And number 2, realize that this year, your life will not go the way that you planned. Amen.